This is Scott Becker with the Becker Business and the Becker Private Equity Podcast. Today we're visiting with David Pivnick. David is a brilliant lawyer. He's a partner at McGuireWoods, heads up a large area of practice there. He's also a brilliant Canadian by background. And so really on all things that relate to Canada, we typically ask David for his opinion. David, today's subject comes out of, we have a conference coming up at Becker's Healthcare, and two of the featured speakers are Kevin O'Leary and Anthony Rizzo. And one of the, and we sent out lots of promotional direct messages and emails and things about the conference. And one of the responses that we got this week to the discussion on Kevin O'Leary speaking was, a very, very negative discussion from somebody who is Canadian. And he said something along the lines of, that he has publicly suggested that Canada should become part of the United States, defending Trump in connection with business controversies, that he's had lots of trouble with all kinds of other things that he, responded to. He was involved in a boating accident, 2 fatalities, and we said something like, it's entertainment. It's not intended. Kevin O'Leary is not supposed to be really necessarily a role model, but I find him fascinating and entertaining. And the person from Canada responded back, Canada being part of the United States is not entertainment. Business fraud is not entertainment. Defamation is not entertainment. And so we responded back that we agree with you to this Canadian person who is lovely, and that we respect our Canadian brethren greatly. And so I guess what I have a question for you as one of our resident experts on Canada, is this person from Canada, albeit a Canadian, taking himself too seriously and being so critical of Kevin O'Leary, or does Kevin O'Leary deserve that type of criticism? And you are, you hail from 2 brilliant parents who are strongly patriotic Canadians, and we're huge fans of Canada. We certainly don't believe Canada is a great country, should be its own country, of course. I think that's like just a given. But is this, is Kevin O'Leary that challenging and that infuriating to Canadians that we shouldn't allow Kevin O'Leary to speak? Where are your thoughts on this as a Canadian and sort of a cultural expert?
Yeah, cultural expert. That might be the kindest thing anyone's ever said about me. And one thing, it's always good to be on, and never in a million years would have guessed this was the particular topic you were going to ambush me with today, but glad to talk about it, especially after your question, which was the longest question you've ever asked in the history of the podcast. So love that. I think the short answer is some people, and I don't know who this anonymous Canadian is, I have some concern you're going to surprise me afterwards by being like, oh yeah, they have the same last name as you or something. But it seems to me the main takeaway is some people are overly sensitive. And I think this is an example of that. And we will likely now get criticism and feedback, to the podcast about that comment. But I mean, your response was pretty on point, which is you're clearly not bringing in Kevin O'Leary to talk of and deliver a lecture on business ethics or the efficacy of boating effectively. I don't know whether or not he was directly involved in a boating incident. Someone in his boat was. I think there's arguments he's made that he wasn't driving it, if I understand correctly. But that's obviously not why you're bringing him in. And amongst controversial speakers, I would say Kevin O'Leary is on the lower side. And that kind of feedback to you sort of begs the question of, is this, anonymous conference attendee, or perhaps someone who's just monitoring conference speakers around the country for sport, also complaining to Shark Tank and to CNN and NBC and all of the myriad other places that, like you, have determined that Kevin O'Leary is interesting enough that people want to hear him speak on a variety of topics. And he is an interesting guy who attends fancy galas in New York, has a massive, very lucrative watch collection that I happen to monitor, that has a huge card and sports memorabilia collection. Like, there are lots of things about the man that are interesting and that would warrant the very function that you bring him in to speak on, which is keeping an audience actively engaged for an hour where they want to see him speak. So I think the short answer is it really belies reason that somebody would take such significant umbrage with that. And there is a very simple solution, which is they could simply choose not to attend his 1 hour speech at the conference while otherwise enjoying the myriad offerings of more educational and substantive content that will also be provided in all the other meeting rooms at the event. Like that, this feels to me like complaining for the sake of complaining, which I think is unfortunately all too common these days, but not terribly productive.
No, and I took the same approach, but people have serious thoughts. This is a person at a serious company, and so we're used to getting that kind of criticism. We try and bring in people that are too inflammatory. We think of Kevin O'Leary as more of a business-driven person. He's got maybe a little political, but not over the top one place or another. But obviously, people can tend to disagree with that. And you have this fine line between getting to be too vanilla and boring versus trying to keep things interesting and exciting. I mean, we have Anthony Rizzo speaking, but, again, won a World Series with the Cubs, but is he that exciting to listen to? I don't really know. I mean, it doesn't fine, but it doesn't do anything particularly for myself to have Anthony Rizzo speaking, where Kevin O'Leary at least gets a rise out of people, so at least more interesting. And that's part of the goal, without being inflammatory, is to have people that at least are, inspiring, interesting, and exciting, and can cause people to be like, that they actually want to be in the session, that the room's actually crowded to see them. I think a lot of people would be like, who exactly is Anthony Rizzo, particularly if you're not particularly a baseball fan, whereas Kevin O'Leary is more of a household name, I think. So to me, it's much more interesting, even if a little bit, I guess, inflammatory to some.
One thing I will note on the topic of famous Canadians that you've had and are having at an upcoming conference to speak, the great one, not you, Scott, the other great one, Wayne Gretzky, is a terrific speaker, a terrific Canadian, and has also become somewhat controversial in Canada for being perceived as not being sort of full-throated enough in his support of the country and being present, for events relating to our president. And I think, Wayne Gretzky grew up and grew to fame by being the greatest hockey player ever, of which I think there's little doubt, other than maybe for Bobby Orr, but clearly one of the two bets that I would say pretty clearly the best, and is a great Canadian, and a Canadian that I think people should be proud of, but has had that same controversy. But seeing him speak brought pride in me, and he's an entertaining person, which is the whole point. So I think there's a difference. If you were bringing these folks out to speak on politics or to render opinions on controversial topics, I think the criticism would be a bit better taken as compared to the function that they are serving and likely serving quite well at the conference, which is entertaining folks who are choosing to see them speak.
Where do you put, one, we agree with you, and I guess thank goodness for your perspective, because we could put to rest the concept that Canada as a whole has become too sensitive, because I hear you, and I sense that you are not too sensitive to everything, and I think you're probably a good barometer of, not to generalize, but you're now our Canadian sample and survey. So ultimately, we've got 50% that are very sensitive, 50% that are not. And is that a good take on Canadians in general? I mean, Canadians in general, other than President Trump poking the bear the last several years, he never struck me as being so sensitive to everything. But I guess President Trump has hit some really, as poked the bear some, and it's led to that kind of, back and forth. But generally, we've always found Canadians to be overall a pleasure, present company included. Is that a fair sentiment that at the end of the day, Canadians are really nice people, really good people? That's a generalization. There's some bad, there's some good, but not insanely sensitive any more than people are in the United States.
I totally agree. I think your comment on me not being overly sensitive, I think my wife would heartily agree with you to a fault that I'm not sufficiently sensitive. But I think as a general statement, Canadians as a country, not to like group a whole country together, but it's a proud country, and I think it is a point of pride in Canada that there are some differences in culture and the nature of the country between Canada and the States, that they're not just one and the same. But I think that tension has been heightened relative to some of President Trump's comments, which I think have given rise to a higher level of maybe not national pride, which I think was always there, but in the severity, the seriousness with which these topics were taken. Whereas I think several years ago, and probably with just about any other president, Wayne Gretzky showing up on the podium at an inauguration wouldn't have even warranted much news coverage, if any. It would have just been something that happened that no one thought about. And I think it's sort of reflective of the fact that, for better or worse, President Trump can tend to give rise to big feelings in people, good, bad, or otherwise, frankly. Like the people who like him a lot, the people who don't tend not to. And I think his comments, which I think are easy about Canada to say, well, it was largely tongue-in-cheek or to get a rise, succeeded in doing that in a way that I don't think is necessarily reflective of broader, more general sentiments. And I think that's sort of part of President Trump's charm or lack, depending, I guess, on how you're looking at it, in terms of being able to get right to the root of things and cause people to have pretty strong reactions.
No, it's interesting. So I take it by the fact that you've mentioned that President Trump can bring out strong feelings in people, positive and negative, but can really touch people. That must make you a big President Trump fan, that he's got that emotional depth, that he could take those feelings, out of people and bring those out of people. That's a really nice thing to say, David, about the American president. That's really nice.
I think that's bait, Scott. I think what you just did is bait. I am going to rest on my statement that, and as you know, I try and stay apolitical on these discussions, that I'm going to do so here and simply say again, the people that like President Trump like him a lot, and I think the people that feel differently about it feel very strongly differently. And I think the ability to give rise to those big emotions is, for better or worse, one of his qualities. And for what it's worth, just on a much more micro level, I think I tend to give rise to big emotions and big reactions in people, whether or not I necessarily intend it. So maybe I'm sympathetic to that quality, because his is, under media spotlight and scrutiny, whereas mine is at least more contained. But I am sympathetic to the notion of making statements that are tongue-in-cheek, or in my life at least, tongue-in-cheek and intended to be sort of folksy, that may not land always as intended.
No, thank you so much, David. No, I enjoyed the discussion tremendously. I love getting your perspective on everything. It's great fun for me. I hope our audience enjoys it. Again, David Pivnick on the Canadian sense of empathy. We appreciate you joining us so much. I always learn something on very different people's points of view, and I appreciate that greatly. Thank you, David, for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Scott.